welcome to another episode of Patrons and Partnerships. Today, our guest is Dr. David Canton, the Director of African American Studies Program and Associate Professor of History at the University of Florida. Welcome. And if you don't mind, please further the introduction for us.
All right, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, my name is Dr. David Canton, and I'm originally from the Bronx, New York. I received my BA in History from Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, my Master's in Black Studies from The Ohio State University, and my PhD in Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is my second year at the University of Florida, 2 years living in Gainesville. I teach a course on history of hip-hop. I do a course on the civil rights movement in the South and also one civil rights movement in the North. So it's a pleasure to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Just out of curiosity, how long did it take you to get through school?
Let's see, I received my BA in 91, got my PhD in 2001. So 10 years with, I think, a 9-month break. So yeah, about 10 years.
Very focused.
That's it, right? My thing is get it in when you're young, you have energy, you can stay up late at night, and that's what I did, and now I'm here today.
Wow. So what interested you in African American studies?
That's a great question. So growing up in my house is my father. My father is from St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands. My mother's from Anguilla. And my dad, what I call, developed a racial consciousness. In St. Thomas, a lot of African American sailors would come into the island. We was introduced to like black periodicals like Jet, Ebony Magazine, Pittsburgh Courier, a black newspaper. It's really developed a racial consciousness. In fact, when Emmett Till was lynched, was murdered, he was 15 years old and remembers that Jet magazine in 1955. So when I was in high school, I was always good in social studies, current events. I got that from him, the news, politics, sports, talk, radio. I would read the New York Times, the Amsterdam News, a black newspaper. We always brought home both. I can't think of one right now, but those two we read a lot. But when I went to college, I thought I was going to be a medical doctor. For a lot of first-gen students of color, right? You be a doctor, you make a lot of money, it's noble. I'm going to go donate time in the community, give out some injections, pass out some Band-Aids. It's a win-win. But the reality is that wasn't my passion. So I was a biology major for 4 years, and I just struggled. But I was always good in like humanities, social sciences, sociology, history. Those courses were easy to me. But the math and the science courses, I just struggled, didn't have the passion. So eventually in my 5th year of college, my wife, who I met at Spelman College, why don't you major in history? And I'm like, what can I do with a history degree? Which most students unfortunately say. I knew you can be a teacher, and again, not knocking the profession, but I definitely know from my high school experience in the Bronx, I don't know if I want to do that for 30 years. And then you can do outside teaching. That's all I knew. So finally, when I was at Morehouse, I met a professor, Dr. Joseph Wisdom, who passed about 10 years ago. He had just received his PhD from Howard University, and this was back then he had to write it. They mailed it to him, and they showed me the document. I said, "Wow, did you write that?" And he was like a younger guy, 37, kind of cool, played basketball, just didn't look like your average professor. So we developed some sort of mental relationship. He said, "Dave, why don't you get your master's at Ohio State?" First of all, I'm like, "What? What's a master's? What are you talking about?" It's a 1-year program. Then after that, once I got into history, I was hooked because now it wasn't like work. It was a passion, reading books, talking about ideas, going to conferences. That's really what got me here. And, I was going to know everything about people of African descent throughout the world. And you realize that's insulting. One person can't know all that information, but it's definitely been a passion of mine ever since then. And like I said before, when I became a history major, the rest became history, no pun intended.
It's interesting you talked about people's reaction to your interest in studying history. I had the same thing. I also studied history in my undergraduate school, and someone said the exact same thing to me. What are you going to do with a history degree? So I appreciate that it's something that everyone experiences, and it is, I think, if you study history, it is a passion.
Right. And I tell students, whatever you study, and the thing about a liberal arts degree, and people get it confused, it's the skills. I think oftentimes we put so much emphasis on the STEM, so much emphasis. High schools, programs, grants, research. Even TAs get paid more on the STEM side. We overvalue STEM and undervalue the humanities. And that's why you have all these students that start at UF and the STEM. 2 years, I get an email, "Dear Dr. Canton, I took this class," and boom, the passion hits. But again, I understand because parents are nervous. When you say these humanities discipline, they get nervous. You're going to be broke. You got all this debt. You're going to be in my basement. Get a STEM degree or something you can fall back on is the STEM. But they're not enjoying those courses. Literally don't enjoy it. And it's not about aptitude. Some of them just don't enjoy it. I just don't like computer programming. I'm just not interested. Doesn't mean you're a bad human being, but you're interested in the humanities and the skills, critical thinking, reading, working in groups. These are transferable skills. And I tell students all the time, when you go for a job interview, that I've heard they don't even look at your transcripts anymore. What experiences can you share? Have you developed a podcast? What type of experience? Have you traveled? That's what they're looking for. They're not going to ask you about Black Reconstruction because they don't know about it. They're not going to ask you about the content from American history in 1905 because they don't know. When you cash in on that information, I call small talk. So if you go to a job interview and you see Du Bois's book on the desk, hey, I read that in college. You read that too? That's where it cashes in. But most of the time, they're looking for experiences and skills. Where have you interned? They're not going to ask you specifically about the works in your major. So I try to, when I advise students, I try to emphasize that. And when I always go to like these career workshops, I always try to pay attention so my majors can have the updated information that they made the right decision. And this is what employers are looking for. They're not going to ask you about Ida B. Wells. They don't know about her. But if you see Ida B. Wells in their office, you should comment on it.
That's good advice. Well, today we're here to talk a little bit about Juneteenth. This is the first year that Juneteenth is being celebrated as a national holiday, a federal holiday. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how we got to this point.
All right, that's a great question. So as a historian, you know I'm going to go back. So I think we have to start with the Emancipation Proclamation. We know when the Civil War first started, many of the early victories were by the Confederate Army. The first year or two up in particularly the Virginia area, Battle Bull Run or Manassas, for those who are really Civil War experts. I'm 20th century, but nevertheless, what Lincoln needed was a victory, and they had it on September 22nd, 1862, the Battle of Antietam, which is in Maryland. And that's when he unleashed the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Now, even before that, you have people like Frederick Douglass who's getting access to the White House. Keep in mind that throughout this whole period is people of African descent who are running away, organizing, protesting, using self-defense, whatever means necessary for freedom. So I always try to emphasize to students, when you look at African history, you got to look at the agency, right? We like to look at it top down, that somehow the federal government woke up, had a change of heart. Oh, I'm sorry, we should free Black people. No, it's that pressure from African Americans, right, with white allies. But again, white allies aren't a majority. So that's another myth we like to believe, right, that white abolitionists were a majority. No, they weren't, right? It's like most systems, most people are indifferent or inactive. But nevertheless, the Emancipation Proclamation, he read it, that took effect January 1st, 1863. But let's get this clear. It did not end slavery. I'm going to say it one more time. The Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery. What ended slavery in this country was the 13th Amendment, which passed December 1865. In fact, Delaware and Kentucky had slavery up until the 13th Amendment because they were two of the four border states during the Civil War. The other two were Maryland and West Virginia. So again, when the Civil War started, it was a war to save the Union. When the Emancipation Proclamation kicked in, now it's the war to end slavery, which Black people viewed from day one. Because when that war started, if you read Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, Black folks left. But we can't vision that, right? Because in other words, they had what they call the grapevine, that information, there's no social media, but Black people are speaking. Like you have Black sailors who are going through port towns like New Orleans and Charleston, where they're getting information. So once they knew that war started, it's about ending slavery. So many of them took off and just left. Like Du Bois said, went on strike. But the war also allowed Black men to join the army, 185,000 soldiers. It got rid of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 that by law empowered white people to capture fugitives to return to their slaveholders. So if you were at a Boston pub drinking, doesn't mean you like Black people, but by law you had to chase a Black guy down or a Black person they thought was enslaved. So again, got rid of Fugitive Slave Law. And when the war first started, Black people by law had to be returned to the South. So it's a much more complicated picture than we like to believe. But the Emancipation Proclamation was a military measure, and I think people should read it. I'm going to read a little bit from it to show you what I'm talking about. That on the first day of January, in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforward and forever free. In other words, there were parishes in Louisiana the Union soldiers took over that still allowed slavery. So places that are in rebellion against the United States, they're free, okay? But areas like the border states, areas that the Union controlled in the South, slavery still existed. Now, Lincoln was anti-slavery, but again, this is politics. You see what I mean? But nevertheless, the Emancipation Proclamation was a very important document, only 719 words, but should be read by everybody. In fact, another piece he says it's a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion. This is politics, folks. It's not feelings. It's politics. Even Lincoln said himself, if I can end slavery in one day, I do it. But this is politics. Then the last point he said, and I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence. And he's talking about the free blacks, unless in necessary self-defense. Okay, so again, remember that during slavery, white people can kill slaves and not be punished. But now you're saying, okay, self-defense is allowed. If you have to protect yourself against slaveholders or white Southerners, do your thing. Very important document, but don't forget the role of Frederick Douglass, black abolitionists, and enslaved people themselves helping to change the tide of the war.
How much distinction was made based on those facts that you talked about in the Emancipation Proclamation between a freed slave and someone who was still enslaved? Was that something that was being upheld or enforced in any way?
So again, remember now, we got federalism and state rights. Once he said it, right, for black people themselves, they're going to take off, do what they want to do. If you're a slaveholder, that's still your property. So again, how is it being enforced? Now, when you brought those federal troops in, that's what's being enforced. We'll get to Juneteenth in a minute. But again, for black people themselves, the Civil War always was the war to end slavery, non-negotiable. When the war started, April 1861, folks just left and went up to D.C. and had these major refugee camps where they were underfed. Many of them worked for the Union and didn't get paid. These refugee camps, they were sick, they weren't well kept, but nevertheless, that agency is real, whether it's Harriet Tubman, who served as a spy for the Union Army because she knew all the back roads. This is why history is so important. This is why understanding different perspectives, because if not, you'll overlook all these little nuanced stories. But again, the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery. It was the 13th Amendment. So if we get anything right today, please, this becomes a myth that people just believe. So even in my class at the end of the semester, they'll still put that on the final exam. But it's like 20 myths in American history. No matter what you say, people still believe those myths. And the Emancipation Proclamation ending slavery is a major one.
Okay, so now let's go to Texas.
Yes.
And see what happened there.
Okay. Well, before Texas, since we're in Florida, I got to shout out Florida.
Okay, yes. Please do. That was actually one
right.
of the staff questions.
So May 20th, 1865. All right, so again, let's get our chronology. So the Civil War ends in April 1865. 4-year war, 700,000 deaths. More people died in the Civil War than the total number of deaths in all the wars in American history. So again, Civil War, the fight to end slavery. For some people, they still the Northern aggression, states' rights, but states' rights to do what? When you look at the documents, and again, that's what historians do, look at the documents, you see what's the argument. But nevertheless, May 20th, 1865 in Florida, Union Brigadier General Edward M. McCook came down, read the similar thing like the Emancipation Proclamation that ended slavery in Florida. But again, Florida wasn't the last state. It was Texas, right? And we know, if you look at, I'm an NFL fan, we know who's drafted first, and they have a name for the last draft person. But those in the middle are those in the middle. But nevertheless, as we see in Gainesville, the journey to Juneteenth is a celebration from May 20th to June 19th. But we also see our history is national, state, and local. And it's all about perspective. My parents from the West Indies, so therefore I never heard of Juneteenth. I never had soul food till I went to Morehouse College, because black people are not monolithic. So therefore in Florida or this area, May 20th has big meaning, 520. But if I go to Jersey, different meaning. So again, that's how history works. So it's not that one is better than the other. It's just recognizing, acknowledging that there's histories. So prior to me coming here, May 20th was May 20th. But now living in Gainesville the last 2 years, I understand that. We also see we have states' rights, or we have local cities like it's a paid holiday in Tallahassee for May 20th. So again, we have the federal government, we have states, we have locals. That's the power of democracy. So people can decide their holidays, what they deem is valuable. And it's not one narrative. But then we get to Texas, okay? So on June 19th, 1865, General Gordon Granger, with 2,000 federal troops, announced the end of slavery in Galveston, Texas, which is like a port town outside of Texas. General Order Number 3. Now, by that time, Texas had 250,000 slaves in Texas, one of the western, most southern states. Remember, there's no internet, there's no social media. Now, black people in Texas, probably through their own channels, heard about the Emancipation Proclamation. But again, it's hard. Texas, there's no underground railroad from Texas to Boston. That's a huge state. And then think about its numbers, 250,000 slaves. How many white people in the state? It's very difficult for black people to take up, get up, and walk and get out. Complicated. But nevertheless, people probably heard of the Emancipation Proclamation, but because of demographics, it was difficult in Texas. But nevertheless, on June 19th, General Order Number 3 was read. So again, it's about agency. Free black people were not waiting. You know what? You should celebrate this day. No. Just like the night watch service we'll get to later, they have their own celebrations, recognizing that this date is important in their history. It's almost like they're July 4th. So the first time you have 1866, June 19th, 1866, Jubilee Day. So again, these are local black people in Houston, in Texas, creating this memories, this information, right? This sacred day for people of African descent. And that's why Juneteenth was so important. But again, growing up in New York, parents from the West Indies, our school system, forget about it. Just don't hear about it. In New York, we'll celebrate Caribbean Independence Day or the Carnival. Now, the problem is in our K through 12 system, this is what we're talking about. This is a whole battle over curriculum, that this information should be known in Iowa, in Michigan, in Detroit, in Pennsylvania. But now, because of what happened last year, the federal holiday, now finally Juneteenth, people know about it. But again, unfortunately, it took the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. So again, it's that reactionary posture. But at the same time, there was always black folks fighting for these recognitions. So whether we'll get to it later, Dr. King's holiday, Juneteenth, there was always pressure to get these holidays recognized because African Americans were always on that forefront of doing that. But it always takes a larger, unfortunate death or murder. Oh, wow, we need to do something now. So we can get all into that in terms of the King holiday and Juneteenth having some very similar histories.
Last year, the Library Partnership participated in creating a video for our Juneteenth celebration, and one portion of it was talking to a young woman. I believe she was a junior in high school. We asked her the importance of Juneteenth to her and things that she knew about the holiday, and I asked if she and her friends talked about it, if there was any awareness between her peer group. And she mentioned that they are aware of it, but that it's not taught in school. And also because it falls during the summer vacation, it's not part of their day off or any of their holidays throughout the school year. How significant do you think it is that now that it's a national holiday, that it will bring more awareness to the youth?
That's a great question. So again, it's almost like the Dr. King holiday. Juneteenth is going to require communities like the library, other local communities to do things to celebrate the day. There's so many local events sponsored by local folks because, again, school is out. That's just a reality. It's the same with UF. Faculty is out during the summer, so it just requires planning, organizing events to bring forth the information to young people. Because, like I said, school is out. You're not going to, dear Miss So-and-so of social studies, can you come in today? I'm off the clock. Now, if they want to volunteer their time, but that's why events like this podcast, the Journey to Juneteenth, all those different local events, we just have to make sure you get the word out so students can be engaged. Now, again, let's say when you teach Reconstruction, you could bring up Juneteenth in the class, but that's going to be all the way early in the fall semester. You see what I mean? But nevertheless, this is why this requires community organizations, local libraries to have events throughout the month, which they do here now already, to get more awareness. But definitely you can still, at least in your class during the Reconstruction period, mention Juneteenth. But again, requiring teachers who are underpaid already to do something extra in the summer, that's just not going to happen. So I think that's how we look at it. The interest starts with these programs. When they go back to school in the fall, or you have curriculum meetings, you just find a way to put Juneteenth into the lesson plan.
What would you say to the pre-college age youth to encourage a greater understanding of African American history? And
Well, it's one of those things where, I think history, it's a passion. And I think one of those things where there are students who are passionate about history. Students over time will determine their passion of history, social studies, current events. So I think I don't want to sound nostalgic that when I was a kid, I was reading the news. No, I wasn't. I was watching the Yankees and going to movies. So I think this whole thing about what the young people are not doing, there are plenty of young people who are engaged in these conversations, but there are others that might get engaged later as they mature, get older. Might even be until they get to college. So I don't have this doom and gloom take about what young people don't know, because it assumes that we were young, we knew everything. No, we didn't. Right? So I don't have that approach. I just have an approach where we could do a better job K through 12, putting it out there, and that as they mature, some will take a passion for it, and some, to be honest, like a lot of Americans, unfortunately, will not be engaged in African history or American history. And that's the struggle we have now in this country. History is important, but not all Americans are going to love history. If you believe that, that's naive. The same way a lot of Americans, for a math person, don't like math and are proud to say it. I am not good at math. So everyone's not going to be an expert at African history, but there should still be a foundational, whatever that means. How does one measure it? I think it's relative, but I think at least the holiday, whether it's Dr. King or Juneteenth, it's a start. But we want to make sure the interpretation, because we don't want Juneteenth watered down. I think Walmart had Juneteenth ice cream. That's how capitalism works, right? Dr. King, all major corporations love Dr. King, but they don't love Radical King. So you want to beware of the co-optation of Juneteenth through capitalism, buying T-shirts and hats. At minimum, if you're going to buy, purchase from black store owners, but don't allow the definition of Juneteenth to disappear. Resistance to slavery, black community organization, knowing your history, knowing your culture. Don't lose that over buying ice cream from Walmart. They did pull it, but again, am I surprised by it? Of course not, because that's how capital works, right? How can we commodify anything? Dr. King, Juneteenth, you name it, we can sell it and commodify it and then move away from the original meaning.
you had mentioned Watch Night. Can you talk a little bit more about that and other traditions that can be traced back to Juneteenth or the Emancipation?
Yes, so Watch Night is where we go to a lot of African American churches on New Year's Eve. So Emancipation Proclamation was in full effect January 1, 1863. So on December 31st in 1862, in black churches around the country, it's where people went to church and waited and counted down for 1/163. And that tradition continues in a lot of black churches. We have night watch service. You come in about 10 o'clock, and you go until midnight. Again, some are changing, but nevertheless, that's still the foundation. But it starts from the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, now some states, some places have Emancipation Day, Jubilee Day, in some cities, Milwaukee celebrates Juneteenth. So again, there's national history, there's state, and there's local. Okay, so again, people decide what they want to commemorate, which is a great thing. So again, like I said, here we have May 20th, 1865, June 19th, 1865. But again, now some states you might celebrate, there's some other dates black folks might celebrate in Ohio, a separate date. But nevertheless, they all lead to the same thing about freedom, about justice, about African American agency. So as a historian, you're always trying to, what are the connections, what's similar and what's different, and what's the large story. So you're not getting into you're not getting into an Olympics, what's better than what's more real than what. Those are distractions from the big issue. And I try to engage students on, let's avoid those. You can have them fun, they can joke and all that, but they end up becoming into what's more authentic rather than the big picture.
Well, Do you think that's the significance of having the Juneteenth holiday, is that it has its own relevance, but it is also sort of emblematic of all of the other significant occasions that are important to local, state,
You can
national?
see Juneteenth is like the capstone. In other words, every state has one of those dates where slavery ended. But because Texas was last, Texas is big, right? It's a capstone. Slavery ended in Vermont in 1777. So literally every state you can have some similar type of event, or particularly one with African Americans in charge, but this is just the capstone. But it's under a big picture of what the Emancipation Proclamation, black soldiers fighting in the war, African American freedom, things of that nature. So I think don't lose sight of that. But there's no reason why states can't, like what Florida does on May 20th. You can do something in South Carolina, do something in North Carolina, not a problem. But I think Juneteenth becomes a capstone, and it gets a national recognition, so that if I'm in Iowa, if I'm in Wyoming, if I'm in, in particularly in northern states where you don't think about slavery, even though there was slavery in northern states, this at least should let you to think about it. Now, it's hard because it's during the summer, but nevertheless, that shouldn't be an excuse. So I think as we go the next couple of years or so, keep an eye on ensuring that the message doesn't get co-opted and that communities continue to do what they do, right? Because again, schools are out. So you can't wait for the local school district, but it's what we see going on in Gainesville, all these local organizations putting a month full of events, which I'm excited, looking forward to attending.
Speaking of that, is the African American Studies Department planning any activities or events during the week, the month?
Right. Now, you see, that's the point. So UF, right, faculty on a 9-month calendar. So technically, we're off. So now maybe in the future on my part as director, looking forward, maybe we should plan an event. But obviously, as faculty, we can go to local events. But again, it's been because June 19th, universities are off, or 9-month faculty are off, it's difficult, just like getting school teachers. But it doesn't mean that faculty will not be out in Gainesville celebrating, doing what I'm doing here with you in the podcast. But maybe down the line, maybe plan an event. But again, because faculty's off, that can get complicated. But again, you can, find some folks who may want to volunteer their time. So that's something for next year I'll consider.
Is there anything else that you would like to talk about as far as Juneteenth?
Well, I was mentioned earlier about Juneteenth and the Dr. King holiday, some similarities. Your last two federal holidays are Dr. King, 1986, and Juneteenth, which was on my birthday, June 17th, 2021. But both, what they share in common was, in fact, John Conyers, congressman from Michigan, wanted the King holiday after he was assassinated. So it took from 68 to 86. But again, it's because why? People organized, put pressure to get this holiday. We see Juneteenth early in the 80s and 90s. We see in Texas, it became a paid holiday in 1980, that these were African Americans, this Congressional Black Caucus and others to get in the push to get this recognized. So you just see again that African American history is at the center, this agency. I just think this belief that for a lot of Americans that African Americans are reactionary waiting, but the reality is you see that agency in both of these holidays. But the flip side is making sure that the message that Dr. King we saw his last few years talk about anti-Vietnam, critical of capitalism, poverty, and we see with Juneteenth to make sure the message doesn't get lost. Once you become nationally recognized, the messages gets misinterpreted, right? What is Juneteenth? Freedom of people of African descent, allowed to be free to look for family, get a job, work for wages, right? And take advantage of what opportunities they had in this country. That's the message. And then the flip side is, when you look at it in contemporary, how have systemic oppression continued to prohibit African Americans from doing those things that were promised by the Emancipation Proclamation, by Juneteenth? That's the ongoing conversation that should be had when you have these events.
So what's next?
Well, what's next is we see, unfortunately, we had what happened in Buffalo. We see what happened outside of San Antonio. Now, unfortunately, we still have a long way to go. I think rather than embracing a multiracial democracy, there are many that are still trapped in a past that never really existed. Whether it's how families, what's a nuclear family, whether about who should be a CEO, the reality is, the historical reality is that this is a multiracial democracy, and it's not stopping. You look at the numbers. But rather than embrace that, There are people that are embracing ideologies that were talked about years ago that really never left. And that's the unfortunate part. And that's why history is so important, why the social sciences, why the humanities, psychology, sociology. We put so much emphasis on the STEM, then we're mad when we have these events in Buffalo and in Texas. Well, how does this happen? How does this happen? We have no clue. We don't understand civics and how the power of voting. So the next step is to continue the work that's being done at the K through 12 level, at the college level. We need to re-emphasize the humanities, because we saw it happen in Buffalo and Texas. That's not human. That's not humanity. So we need to re-emphasize humanities. We need to put more money into the NEH humanities. That's what needs to really happen in social studies and English, that the same energy we put into STEM, robotics, artificial intelligence, we just go Google Gaga over that stuff. But if I say the humanities, everybody gets kind of quiet. It's a waste of time. Nobody reads those books. Why? It's not important. But then we're upset when there's lack of empathy. We're upset when there's poverty, there's homeless. We just put our hands up. Nobody knows what to do because we don't have a solid foundation in humanities, including history.
Well, and I think you mentioned it earlier too. The discipline, the practice of critical thinking is emphasized in the humanities. And I think that especially with so much social media and the access, we have instantaneous communication and news, and that's been really lost, that people can't discern for themselves whether something that they're being shown or told is true or accurate. They don't have the tools to find out true information. And I think that I believe that you're correct.
And it's been difficult because of social media. Like when we went to school, the teacher would come in, the New York Times or Time Magazine said X. Okay, if you understand, you might have looked at it. Nowadays, because everything is so niche marketed with information, there's no common thread. So if you said you read Huffington Post, that might be 4 students. I read this, 3 students. They don't watch TV, so it's hard to come in and develop that. What's something we can talk about on a news issue that 80% of the students have read? Then, like you also said about critical thinking, I think that, again, school is about making you a critical thinker. That's a skill set. Understanding perspective, evidence, and interpretation. Those are skills. That's what's taught in the humanities. Unfortunately, for a lot of us students, we go to school, it's about just getting that job, but not critically thinking, right? So in other words, we'll have students, I want to be in a nursing school. Okay. But we realize in the health profession, there's a belief that black people feel less pain than white people. So if you start from that premise, and I come in with a knife wound and you come in with a mosquito bite, they're going to treat you first. Now that's because when you went to undergrad, you went to all these classes, you didn't take these classes in African American studies. So therefore, you've internalized these racial stereotypes. That's the problem. Real estate, you went to school, you went to business, you got your degree in business, you want to sell homes, you're denying black people because you feel that they have bad credit, but you don't understand the history of wealth inequality. You see what I mean? You don't take the time to sit down and let's go, hey, what happened? Well, I lost my job during COVID. I don't have 20%, I have 17%. Are there any programs? You're not going to take the time to understand that history, which the assumption is somehow black people messed up. Infant mortality, we saw the congressman the other day that we know historically racism and sexism leads to bad health outcomes. But if you don't take those classes, you just go through the health program, you're going to internalize the belief that black women don't want to be healthy. That's what we're dealing with out here. That's why it's more important than ever to get these students, whether they're a minor, taking some classes, but really have to realize that information is valuable. That makes a difference in patient care, educational outcomes. But people don't see it that way, right? They just see it as I'm coming to school to be X. That knowledge is not as valued, but guarantee in your career, it's going to come to you face to face. And that's when we have these problems, whether it's at the work, at the airlines, not understanding these histories is leading to these problems all over this country.
So in brief, do we just bring more awareness to it? It's just constant work of having to.
Yep, that's why they call it the struggle, right?
refocus.
That's why it's the struggle. You don't let despair. I sound like Dr. King now. Don't let despair defeat you because it can be overwhelming. We saw again Buffalo a week later. you could throw your hands up, but the reality is you have to continue that struggle, and that's where history comes in. Because obviously, if you look at African American history, you can imagine the enslaved, living Jim Crow. They could easily gave up, but they didn't. So obviously people can say, well, things are better, but there's still work to do. And just because you say things are better doesn't mean there's no racism. It just means there's more work to do. And with all the information and resources now, there's no reason, not to continue and engage to make society a better place.
Dr. Canton, thank you so much for being our guest today. I look forward to posting and publishing this. This episode should air on June 16th, just in time for...
Oh, day before my birthday.
Yes,
Sounds
just
good.
in time for your birthday.
Okay.
So thank you so much.
Thank you. Enjoyed it. Looking forward to doing this again.